Hi, I'm Mimi Chan. Welcome to Culture Chat. Thanks for joining the conversation. Dr. Mark Cheng is a Chinese medicine and acupuncture practitioner in Los Angeles, California. He is also a lifelong martial artist as well as an expert in strength and conditioning. He's had the unusual privilege of training directly with StrongFirst founder and chairman Pavel Tsatsouline and with legendary Bruce Lee disciple and martial arts luminary Dan Inosanto. Dr. Cheng shares his philosophy on why slowness is the mother of all good movement. We also discuss how he integrates his knowledge of medicine, science, and strength training with martial arts into his practice of helping clients move to feel and live better. I truly enjoy these conversations and hope you do too. Please share this podcast with others and rate it on your platform of choice if you do. You can also take one extra step to help keep this podcast going and show your love by donating to the show on patreon.com/seafoodmimichan or on my website. Even as little as $1 per month goes a long way. Thank you so much for the support. I appreciate you. For comments or suggestions, email me at mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or reach out on social media at seafoodmimichan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Mark. Thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat today.
It's my honor.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's wonderful to have you here. We spoke off air a little bit. We have a lot of the, same friends. We move in the same circles. So it's just fine. It's about time that we had this conversation.
I'm glad we could make it happen.
All right. It's been like an insane 12 months for the world, let alone here in the US and everything. But like literally the whole world has been like turned upside down. And so I just like to kind of start with like, how are you? How have things been for you and your family?
Things have been kind of wild. I mean, it's been crazy. My parents who are here visiting me, I say in quotes, from Delaware, came right before the pandemic hit. And then when the pandemic hit, they were like, they're elderly, so they didn't exactly feel that safe as far as traveling back. So they've been here with me, which I've been trying to cajole them into moving here for over a decade. But they've been here now continuously for over a year. So it's been in one sense a little bit unsettling for them, like a disruption in their natural flow and plan of things. But on the other hand, it's been great because we've gotten to spend so much time as a family, and they've gotten to spend so much time with my kids, which has been outstanding. So there's been a lot of opportunity in the weirdness of pandemic.
Wow, that's crazy. So they came out to visit and then literally they're stuck there for like a year now. We're coming on like 1 year since all the lockdowns. And I've been looking to California because I'm over in crazy Florida, and like we get to fight for who's handling this pandemic worse and how bad things are going. Florida, to me, Florida always quote unquote wins because it's just such a cluster here. But I know things are absolutely insane there. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. It's crazy in some sense, I think, because there's no uniformity, right? Like there's a lot of opinions. There's a lot of people throwing out their opinions and not a lot of context. And also, unfortunately, in what seems to be a metabolic illness, because people's metabolisms are so different, people's biomes are so different, people's blood chemistries are so different, you're going to see different manifestations of the illness. And because people see different manifestations, they go like, oh, well, then it must be a hoax. It must be this. It must be that. Rather than going like, it's attacking people differently based on what you come to the table with. And so our inability to contextualize is once again screwing us.
And the media.
Yeah, there's certainly that too.
Yeah. So as a doctor, because this is fascinating, you, for our listeners who are just meeting you for the first time, you have this amazing background of integrating medicine and martial arts and strength training and movement and so many different things. And so, I of course connect with you on so many levels. And I wonder like what kind of advice do you give to someone as we are hopefully heading out of this madness, but also like throughout it, right? So we've been telling people, keep your immune system up, get stronger. Health is the last thing you want to neglect at this point in time. But I would like to hear from you, since you have such a unique qualification and expertise in that area. Like, what have you been sharing with people in order to not just doing the whole, mask up, physical distance, but from like a health standpoint?
Sure. I think at least in this country, I can only speak to my own experience, and most of what I see. I think in general in this country, in the States, uh, a lot of our biggest problem is that we think more is more rather than less is more. So more food is better, more training is better, more workout is better, more intensive a workout is better, more hours of work is better rather than quality. And so our inability to recognize or take the time to invest in learning about, employing, and then optimizing those qualities, I think are putting us in a bit of a bind. When it comes to food, for example, like we've, you know how like with Chinese people, right? Like one of the greetings is like "你吃饭没?"
Right.
So like it's
Have
always
you
like,
eaten
"Did you
yet?
eat yet?" Right? And so like if you answer in the negative, then it's like, "Oh my God, like are you okay? Like let's get you some food," rather than like, no, I'm good, I'm good. I just I'm not hungry, or maybe today I'm fasting, and we know now that through fasting, sometimes that's one of the key ways of kicking on our immune system. But try and explain that to someone from the old country, and it's like, no, 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 you have to eat to keep your strength up to do. And it's a different paradigm, because of context again. If we were living in a predominantly like manual labor type lifestyle where we're putting out high physical exertion, and there's also nutritional instability, meaning like I don't know when my next meal is, then yeah, then that oh you must eat is really more appropriate. But I think one of the things that people don't understand these days, especially in a country where food is fairly readily available for people of that demographic, is that like you actually are healthier with less, because you train your body metabolically to make use of what you take in. And one of my friends likes to use the phrase opportunistic omnivore. Humans evolved as opportunistic omnivores. So it's like we don't need to always eat meat. We don't need to always eat vegetables. We should be able to change our food sources. And the more we can change our food sources and train our bodies to be metabolically adaptable, then we are more resilient, we are more robust. And so like to train our bodies that like we are always going to have food at this exact time and this exact amount and these exact proportions and this exact flavor, we become rigid, we become weak. So I think that's something that I would love to see more educators speak on. I would love to see more medical professionals address as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I often get frustrated about is I'll take my mom or mother-in-law or someone to the doctor, and they immediately, oh, well, you're on the borderline for high BP or high cholesterol, so here's a pill. There's no discussion on nutrition and health and fitness and working out, or what else are there other options. Like, I am not anti-medicine. If you need a specific treatment for a major disease, I'm all about it. I've got the vaccines. I'm not everything has to be holistic, but I just find it incredible that, especially in the United States and coming from a Chinese background, right, that a lot of it is we do ginger tea. If you start coming down, there's a lot of things that you can do naturally, right? So I just find it frustrating that there's not a lot from Western medicine in the nutrition side, and that I find that it's a very outdated. Like, they're still not really kind of keeping up with what I think a lot of the science tells us, like what you just shared with different things of food, and not everything works for the same person, but it's just like the lowest thing on the recommendation list when you go to a lot of doctors. And I get it. They don't have a lot of time. They see a patient, they've got their 15 minutes, it's in and out. Most patients don't want to put in the work. But if you don't have a caretaker to go with someone to the doctor and say, no, 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 wait, can they do this, this, and this? Will this be better? And they're like, yeah, absolutely. Are you willing to help them do that? Then yeah, you don't need this pill yet, right? Like, you're not in that serious phrase, but like, there's just that frustration. And so what do you think can be done? Like you said, there's no education out there, but is it us as the patients that need more education, or is it the doctors that need more education? Because I really find the
Honestly,
nutrition thing is lacking.
yeah, I think it's both. And I think we're lucky because we live in a time when there are people like podcasters Drew Purohit his partner, Dr. Mark Hyman. For me as a person whose doctorate is in Chinese medicine and acupuncture, it's always cool to see people who are MDs and DOs and people who are quote unquote Western, who understand that there's that context that needs to be respected more, as far as diet, as far as movement, as far as mindset. And as far as just simple things, like things that we take for granted, like breathing, like how do you optimize your breathing? Chinese people have been talking about Heigong, Qigong, or breathing exercises since time immemorial. But it's amazing how many people in the modern fitness or modern wellness world are just now starting to pay attention to that. And what we didn't do, or maybe we tried our best as Chinese immigrants to do, is like share the exercises, but we couldn't really contextualize in the Western standpoint quite the way that people needed to be able to wrap their brains around it. So now when we talk about, okay, some of these exercises that you do as far as posture, as far as breathing and expanding the abdomen or controlling the contraction in the abdomen, like actually trains you for diaphragmatic control and pelvic floor activity and, things like that. And if we can use the speech or use the terminology that people can wrap their brains around in a Western framework, then, I think it's a lot more palatable, a lot more digestible. So now our generation, like you and me, I think in a lot of ways, we're the first generation to be able to grab onto that, to really be that bridge.
Yeah.
So
I
as far
love that.
as
No. I was just going to say, I love that you just kind of shared that, because I feel like you just articulated everything that in the last 10 years or so, I've been really coming to realize a lot more. So, of course, I teach traditional Kung Fu, and, coming from someone who's learned from their father, it's not like you could ask like a million questions. Why do you do this? Or how come this or that? You don't ask, right? Like that's not really part of the tradition, but it's
right,
been wonderful for me to learn from a lot of people way smarter than me, way more knowledgeable in terms of the fitness and science side of things, science-based, movement and understanding, why your knee and your toes should be lined up so that you're not tearing your MCL or ACL. Like there's just like, it makes sense when I do something physically, but I was never able to articulate, like you said, the science behind it, or like kind of bridging that gap. And my husband, Oscar's been a huge help with that, because he just loves hearing from experts such as yourself and kind of talk and share that knowledge. So I think you're right, having just kind of more exposure to that. I will say in the last 5 or so years, there has been a better, I think, trend to exposure. Would you say that we're headed in the right direction, or do you think we're still kind of in the dark ages of that gap being filled?
ooh, damn, that's quite a phraseology there. I think in some ways we're always going to be in the dark ages. Like we're always going to be like not aware of what we don't know, and that to me is the most dangerous thing. Or we're going to be too damn sure about what we don't really know. Take for example knee alignment, like you mentioned, like the MCL. Like if you look at some of the Southern fist styles when they do their ma, the feet are like pointed straight ahead, right? And then the knees are supposed to track right over the toes. And then you'll hear people say like, oh, if you're squatting that low and your feet are strict parallel and pointing straight ahead, that's too much torque on the knee. My question to them is, torque on whose knee? Like if you grew up and you have a hard time even just like bending your knee in such a way that tracks over your toes,
Mm-hmm.
and like you squatting like that for any length of time is a new thing, then yeah, okay, maybe you want to start with your foot positioning, toes pointed out so your knees align over your toes. But if you've already got that soft tissue elasticity plus that strength, then you have the arch strength on top of that, then that kind of rotational power that you're getting from keeping your feet straight and prying your knees out and sitting your butt down at the same height as your knees, that's different, because you are now asking a question of the body, or of a body that's already been prepared. So context again is king. I think that's very
Yeah.
important for a lot of people to realize.
I think so too. There was actually this YouTube video that I had to get taken down, and I usually just let a lot of stuff go, but it was like literally a video of a bunch of things my father does because he's a little bit superhuman. Like my husband and I have
Yeah.
looked at him and we're like, yeah, he's superhuman. So, he does a lot of those stances where his knee doesn't align. But my husband's like, yeah, but his tissue, his body, he's moved like this forever. He's conditioned in a way that, on whose knee, like you said, on whose, like you're,
Right.
it's like how you so it's just like anything else, it's in training, in repetition, safely though, right? And so this is what I try to help bridge that gap even at my school, like with an instructor, like they maybe have been doing this since they were 4 years old, so for them they can squat no problem either way. But I'm like, hey, this guy's 42, he's just coming in here for the first time, never done physical activity. You have to learn that like to kind of bridge that and explain like that their body's not ready. You have to take them through this side of it and like find that scale of progression and regression. And that's something that we learned from the
Totally.
great Mike Boyle. And it's been fascinating to be able to bridge that. And that's why I was so excited to talk to you, because you not only come from the martial background, but you do the FMS and your FSG and just like there's just so many things that I'm curious in how you've been able to take from all of these different expert fields and kind of meld them into one. And like what drew you to those different organizations? So of course you have your own background, but I know that you specifically are active in FMS and FSFG, and I'm sure maybe some other things you can fill me in.
Honestly, everything. This is going to sound like kind of a blow off answer, but honestly, like I feel like almost everything good that's happened in my life is sheer luck. Um, I'm not saying that to be humble. I'm saying that God's honest truth. Like the only thing that I can say that like I maybe have pushed for on my own is just like out of love, martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've loved martial arts since I was a kid. So I always say that like, the martial arts are the source of everything good that's come into my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so starting from traditional martial arts, I was really fortunate. I mean, I didn't really get to start training formally until like I came out to LA for college.
Mm-hmm.
I had a little bit of training from my father. Just, my dad taught me some Tai Chi when I was a kid. And so it was great to get my teeth into some of the martial arts with that. But as far as really training, like I started training Shotokan karate with Tsutomu Oshima, who, for your karate people, they'll know him as the guy who translated Karate do Kyohan. So he's like, one of the true pioneers of Shotokan here in the States. Around the same time, I started training with a Shaolin master named Andy Hong. Also started training with the late Professor Daniel Lee, who was Yang Style Taiji and also one of the, probably most well known as a student of Bruce Lee's. So those are just the three that I started training with right when I got to SoCal. Never mind others who are like my late Sifu and Fat Gaku and Arthur Lee, and his son Harlan. My first Shuai Jiao teacher, Dr. Daniel Wong, and then my Shuai Jiao master, Grandmaster David Lin, who's since regrettably passed away,
Yes,
and a
yes.
bunch of other teachers. And like now, I spend the majority of my time training at the Inasano Academy, and everyone in the world of martial arts pretty much knows exactly who Guro Dan Inasano is.
Mm-hmm.
So martial arts for me has been like an intrinsic. It's always been part of my life, and I think until my last breath, it will certainly be. But everything else from there is kind of like dumb luck. As far as strength training outside of martial arts, one time I was treating Guro Inasano. So actually, it's a funny story about how I got to meet him. I was treating a Silat master, the late Victor Dutois, and Pak Vic said, "Oh my God, this is great! You're helping me so much. You should really meet one of my students." I go, "Oh, that'd be an honor, sir." He goes, "Oh, I'm sure you've heard of him." I go, "Oh, who is he, sir?" He goes, "Dan Inosanto." And I go, "Wow, yeah, I've heard of him, sir. No doubt about it." And so I think he texted Guro Dan, and then Guro came in and was like, "Hi, I'm Dan Inosanto." I go, "I know exactly who you are, sir." Yeah. So it was cool. How I got to meet him was as a patient and provider,
right,
type interaction. So that was kind of what opened the door to a bunch of other things. He one time came into the office and said, "Doc, I have a favor to ask of you." I'm like, "Sure, sir, anything you want." He goes, "Well, you've got my lower back feeling good, and it hasn't felt this good for the first time in like forever. But one of my students paid for these sessions for me to be training with this Russian weightlifting coach, and I'm kind of worried. And like, for the first time, my back feels good. I don't know what this coach is going to do. I don't know what he's about. Like, would you mind being there to observe so that like, if I get hurt, you can be like, either put me back together and or the voice of like the medical voice to say stop."
Right.
I go, "Yeah, sure. Be glad to." Who was the Russian weightlifting coach? Pavel Tsatsouline.
Of course.
So I'm like, yeah. And so that's how that was my first exposure to kettlebells directly through Pavel.
Wow.
And so, Guru started training directly with Pavel on a weekly basis. And Guru asked me to be there for the sessions. And then at one point, I can't remember if it was Pavel himself or Roy Harris, who was also there at the time, said something like, "So you're going to man up and join us today?" So I was like, well, so that's how I got into kettlebells.
I love it. I love it. I think it's amazing though, because I don't want to sound all like, oh man, it's mystical or anything, because it's just like such a stereotype. But I feel like there's something to be said for the luck part, because I feel like you put out good energy in the world, you're doing good things and helping people. And that's just what happens. Like people like to say to me, or even my father, "Oh, you're so lucky." I'm like, I don't know if it's just luck. I think it's hard work. I think it's like, putting out that good energy. And so I think that has a lot to do with it as well. And there is being in the right time and right place. There is some luck, but I think that's awesome. That's so amazing. And so since then though, you really manned up and you're like, you went all the way with the kettlebells. It's a big part of your
Well,
life.
I'm still, I feel like I'm going probably the other direction instead of like growing upward and outward, even though I've been, privileged to be ranked as a master instructor, as an SFG. I feel like now the more I train, the more I'm going back to what I call the three kings of lifts, which to me are the swing/deadlift, the get up, and the squat. The more I look at those three, the more I see just like there's so much value in them as far as fundamentals that people gloss over, and especially in terms of rehabilitative stuff. Like for me, my mantra, my guiding principle is make every rep rehabilitative. So if you're trying to do something as a gut check, that's great as far as testing, but as far as training to me is about like making the envelope bigger, not like trying to put micro tears in it, but like actually just how can we make that envelope wider and more thick, more resilient? So when I look at the swing, the get up, and the squat, man, there's just so much in there that it's like I could spend forever just investigating and improving how I do those.
And I have a feeling your martial art background has a lot to do with your principle and thinking in that as well, right? Because martial arts is very much about going deeper and exploring and spending hours on maybe one movement. And a true martial artist knows this anyway, not just the guy who comes in off the street and is like, "I want to learn all the weapons here and how to fly like Jet Li in this movie," or whatever, right? Like a real martial artist knows that the fundamentals and the basics is what is advanced. Like that is the higher level of learning, right? And so I feel like there's such a connection, because I am such a newbie when it comes to kettlebells. I've been quote unquote trying to do them for a long time, but that's kind of my husband's realm. But I really enjoy it because I really felt like there was a bit of that. Like I love the swing, the get up, and like the squat, right? Like so I feel like martial artists tend to take to that, so I love that you kind of mentioned that. I feel like that might kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and also too, like with the FMS, I mean, one of the things that Gray Cook talks a lot about is it's like we should train the deadlift and preserve or maintain the squat. So like as far as the squat goes, like to me, there's so much hip health. And one of my colleagues, I believe, I can't remember who, so I don't want to name names and be corrected later on. But one of my colleagues, I think, posted a paper or published a paper saying that there's like a 1-to-1 correlation between anterior hip restriction or immobility and lower back pain. So it's like if we have good hip control, good hip mobility, good hip strength, and are able to express that strength through a variety of ranges of motion, that's like an insurance policy on our backs. Like, who wouldn't want that?
Yeah. And I feel like it's such a misunderstood exercise, the squat, right? Most people, like whether you're a martial artist, a strength trainer, or anything, or just general population, people always say, I can't squat because I have a bad back or bad knee. And we're always like, that's exactly why you should be, learning to do this movement and doing it safely. I think it's really has this bad reputation for it's only for people who have perfect mobility or who are young. And I would then tell them to look at Asian elderly people who are squatting and like preparing food all day, and that's the position they're in. And there's something about that. Like we're born, we move around, we roll around, and we get up, and like squatting is just so natural. And it's something that we lose because of these wonderful things that we call chairs that have kind of caused us to be a bit lazy. But maybe if you could talk a little bit more about kind of that health benefit, because I think that people need to kind of hear that connectivity of why they need to do the squat and why it's exactly for what people counterintuitively think.
It's interesting because one of my colleagues talks about, actually, Mark Rifkin talks about the body as a conservative system. Like what you don't use, you lose. And it's definitely that much as far as the squat. As you mentioned, with in Western society, we use these chairs. So like we're getting really good at like sitting for extended periods of time in situations where our hip joints are bent 90 degrees or ish, because depending on how much we slouch and let our butts slide forward on the chair, maybe our hips are not even flexed at 90 degrees and more like of an obtuse angle, and more of that flexion is coming from our lumbar spines. But if you look at the deep squat, like the ground squat, right? Like that's maximal. We're looking at more maximal ranges of motion as far as hip flexion. We've, like you said, become lazy because of whatever. There's acculturation. Don't sit on the floor. Don't squat on the floor. It's dirty down there. It's primitive down there. Oh, it's low class down there. While chairs definitely make it easier for us to be able to come back to standing, they also rob us of the ability to control those ranges of motion that we had naturally as little kids. And so, like, people then go into all of these interesting arguments about like, oh, well, this ethnicity's hips are meant for squatting. That ethnicity's hips are not meant for squatting. To me, that's all trash. And, I know that comes across as a little bit hard, but like, let's talk about it for what it is. I don't think it's an issue of genetics, because if we took people from across the genetic spectrum and raised them from infancy all the way up to adulthood, squatting all the way down and sitting on the ground and getting up and down from the ground, like genetic expression is going to be genetic expression, but I can guarantee you that they'll all still be able to maintain the squat and be able to get up and down. Now, when you look at changes in culture, meaning like, oh, well, since the 1600s or the 1700s, the nobles and the aristocrats were sitting in chairs. Well, then, of course, there's going to be different skeletal expression because of soft tissue load. So, I think it's really important for us to be able to contextualize that.
Yeah.
People are going to be really quick to saying that like, oh, no. This person's hips aren't meant to squat. I call bullshit on that. So
absolutely. Yeah. Well, you can look at every nationality of baby and they're all able to squat, right? It's not like, oh, this
absolutely
has never been able to. So it's a matter of you don't use it, you lose it. Right. Which is why.
And yeah. And really what you train, your body will remold to, right? Like take a guy like a Masoyama that's going to be punching stuff all day long, or Higaonna Sensei and Goju-ryu. Like these guys have like wicked knuckle calluses, right? And why? Because there's a specific adaptation to impose demand. Like you put a demand on a particular set of tissues or on a structure, then there's going to be an adaptation, right? So like if your body only has to adapt to sitting in a chair, there's going to be a soft tissue adaptation. When the soft tissue adapts in a certain way, whether that's building greater capacity to do something or losing the capacity to do something, the skeleton will then remold because that soft tissue is pulling on it in different ways. So, yeah, I mean, like until we can contextualize that throughout the course of life and understand that, like, okay, up to age 3 or 4, These kids were on the floor, they were playing, they were sitting on the floor, they were rolling around, they're doing all the things that little kids do. And then once they were old enough to quote unquote follow instructions and behave, then they start sitting in chairs, working on tables, not able to fully flex, not fully able to extend. Then we realize that it's our acculturation that's robbing us of those ranges of motion.
Yeah, I love that explanation. And what I think you would be also valuable is if you could also share that people saying, well, it's too late for me now. Cause I know I don't know much about it, but my husband always says, oh, your cells every year, your tissue changes. And so like maybe you could kind of speak to that where people are like, well, I'm not 5 anymore. I'm already in my 30s or 40s, or that it's just too late, right? Like they're kind of giving up on the idea that their body can do certain things.
What age did you just say? Was that 30s and 40s?
That's what I have people who are denying that they're
Wow.
able to do it. Well, you've
Wow.
had
Okay.
students.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh, totally. 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 So here's an interesting vignette for you. I was working with a celebrity musician's wife
Mhm.
as a private student, and I was actually training her in Tai Chi at the time,
Mhm.
and focusing a lot on just like awareness of posture and movement while maintaining that posture rather than going like what we normally do. Human beings, like when we start investigating something, we automatically bring our eyes and our heads and our necks closer. So from profile view, right? If I'm standing up straight, but I'm reading something, I'll go like, my eyes will reorient to be able to see that more efficiently, right?
Right.
The problem is that over time, like I'll start looking more and more and more like this. So then there's more of that neck flexion. So with this musician's wife, one of the things that we worked on was like, okay, I want you to be aware of when you're doing these movements and you're actually like focusing on your hands rather than like actually letting your hands kind of revolve around you like a gyroscope.
Mhm.
And it's funny because she came back to me after one session, and I remember she told me that she'd been to see her doctor for a physical, and she goes, "I got to tell you about my doctor's appointment." And I was just like, "Ooh, is this going to be good or bad?"
Right.
Like normally when a client says like, "Yeah, I really want to talk to you about what happened at this doctor's appointment," I'm like,
Oh
and they're like, "Should I be
no.
biting my nails about this?" And she goes, "My doctor gave me just a general physical and then like wanted to see how I'm doing as far as everything else, but they measured my height 4 times." And I'm like, are you was there a problem? And she goes, well, he thought so at the beginning because like he read the chart and like I'd grown an inch and a half.
Mhm.
And at the time she was, I believe, 60 or 65. So
Yeah, that
to
makes
me that
sense.
that tells you that like if you can change skeletal alignment because you're aware of soft tissue engagement, and that's neurological perception, right? Like your brain perceives like, okay, this is sitting up straight versus like, oh, okay, this is sitting up straight.
Mhm.
These little things as far as like we think we're sitting up straight versus like we're actually mechanically sitting up straight. There's so much other possibility that can happen. Like if our soft tissues, if our muscles put a different load on our bones, then our bones over time will remodel. Now there's a limit to everything, right? Like a
Mhm.
lot of
Yeah.
us who have like bony degenerative changes have those degenerative changes because we've been training in a certain way. And unfortunately, some of us define ourselves by that kind of training.
Yeah.
So like, no, no, I have to train this way because that's how I train. Yeah, but no. I mean, even language changes, right? Like, I mean, if you go to Hong Kong today, like the Cantonese you hear today is going to be way different than the Cantonese you heard back in the 80s.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like, I think the things that we think of as cast in stone, really, including our skeletons in a lot of ways, need to be revisited in terms of perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. um I think it's interesting because you have this perspective of being able to take the science side, so you kind of become like an authority on it. Like people believe, do they believe you more since you have the doctor, or do you find it's still a bit of a challenge because people are very resistant? I find to wanting to change. Like even if you're telling them, "Hey, you can change," you would think that would be great news. But a lot of times I find there's so much resistance to the work that may be involved in that change. And I wonder if, as a fellow teacher and all that, but maybe you've got the doctor and that kind of helps you, or do you feel like people are just resistant and that's their nature?
I think people. So another friend of mine, Peter Crone, has a great saying that people's biggest addictions are to their history or to their past. And so people like to define themselves like, no, it's this way for me. So that's how it is for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so people will define themselves based on that. It's been my experience that, on the other hand, if you challenge someone with the right string, like you know how to pull on just the right string of challenge, like not in such a way to disrespect them or irritate them or whatever, but just like dangle the carrot in just enough of a way that they want to chase it,
Mm-hmm.
because their ego now got called into play.
Mm-hmm.
And you dangle the right carrot, meaning like you give them the right goal that like is going to move them in the right direction, that you can enact change. So
Right.
do I think it's an issue of initials after a name? I don't think so. I think it's what's incumbent upon us
Mm-hmm.
is more how do we communicate, and our communication skills are going to come from our own level of understanding. So we as hopeful change makers need to do a better job of understanding the situations at play, not only in terms of like what the ideal is, but also empathizing better about like, this is what this person's coming to the table with. Like, okay, yeah, they need to squat and they were told not to squat because their knees hurt, their back hurts, their neck hurts, that like the laundry list and the litany of things. But it's incumbent on us as movement professionals, as wellness professionals, as high performance professionals, as medical professionals, as kids, our kids to our parents, as parents to our kids, whatever, as leaders, to be able to say, okay, let's do this first. So like Coach Boyle would say, like, making the right progressions and regressions. But the term that I use a lot is stepping stones,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if I wanted to cross a pond, if the stepping stones are too far apart, then I may have to like struggle to make that leap. And if I don't have that kind of jumping skill, I'm going to end up in the drink. Now, for people that don't necessarily have that kind of motivation to get to the other side, and they don't want to end up wet, so they don't want to be intimidated. So it's up to us to make those stepping stones achievable. Like one of the things I talk about with K3, my current project, is that every endeavor that we do in training should have three considerations, what I call the three kings of programming. And if you can't answer yes to all three of these things, it shouldn't be in your program. Is what I want to do beneficial? Is it challenging? And is it fun? If it's not beneficial, why do it? If it's not challenging, then you won't grow. You won't adapt. If it's not fun, you'll resent it. So there will be a kind of emotional / hormonal negative reaction to it.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning like, crap, I don't want to see that kettlebell again. Or like, oh my God, I got to do like the, thigh pa again. Oh, I hate that thing. Like whatever the exercise is, right? If there's a resentment to it, then maybe let's go down a different road. Like let's find something that you can do that you enjoy, that's going to help you break into that skill set that you resent.
Yeah.
So when it comes to squatting, teaching people like, okay, great. I want you to just work on this first. See if you can get your back really straight and then pry your knees apart, like a gentle plie, right? Working on that first. Instead of using the term squat, which people automatically have in some people, like you're saying, like the people that are the resistant ones that you might be working with, like just giving them an exercise like, hey, I'll challenge you with this. Can you try this?
Mm-hmm.
See how your body does with that. Oh man, that's some work. Oh man, I'm really feeling it in these muscles. Awesome. You know that those muscles are the ones that are going to help make the squat accessible to that client or to that athlete or that patient. But they don't have to know that.
Mm-hmm.
They just have to know that, like, unless they want to squat and that is their goal, it's their stated goal, like all they can feel out is like, oh my God, I've been really working these muscles.
Right.
Amy really trained me so well. So like that's the thing to me. Like you've got to understand your subject matter and then understand how to communicate, like, and empathize as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I enjoyed reading on your website was one of the philosophies that kind of ties us into something that you spoke about earlier, which was in the beginning, which was, here in this country, it's more, 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 and it's go, go, go. And Oscar and I just did a podcast on the impatience of the society that we're in to want to have results immediately. And one of the quotes on your site, and I'll list the whole thing here, but it's you start with slowness is the mother of all good movement. And I just love that because it resonates on so many levels. Perhaps you can expand on it and why it was so important for you to write.
Gosh, I should really look up that whole quote because it
I
was
have
quite
it
a
here.
long quote.
Yeah.
God, yeah. In fact, I will look it up right now. I may actually have it, but the whole quote was an interesting one because it really talks about how like there's so many attributes that we can't access until we learn how to go slow. And I think like if you look at sports, for example, right? Like if there's an event that happens, like let's watch this replay, and so automatically the announcer or the commentator will say, let's watch this replay, and we watch the replay first at speed and then we watch it slow mo, and slow mo allows us the time and the leisure to be able to perceive things in greater detail. The problem with like doing things in our like take it for granted speed is that little things creep in, little errors or little glitches creep in, and we don't have the chance to become aware of them. And if we're not aware of these issues, we can't address them. So, like, I always use the example of tone of voice, right? Like, people, especially in relationships, will say, like, I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak to me with that tone of voice or something along those lines. And then the partner might say, like, well, I wasn't using a tone of voice. I don't know what you're talking about. And then they'll, like, they might body language or whatever throw out some sort of resistance or some sort of defensiveness. And it's unconscious, like not even subconscious, totally unconscious. They don't even know they're doing it. And so the that kind of slow mo playback allows you to take the heat off of something and give you a chance of perception, developing perception in a lower pressure environment. So if we want to be able to move well, let's practice moving slower so we can perceive all those little losses of control along the way. Same thing with speech. Same thing with like, how we're breathing. Same thing with our lives. Like I can say for myself as a dad, like when my son was born, I was so like, up to my eyeballs in the rat race that as a dad, I don't think I was really that present for him in a lot of ways. Like I tried to do a lot of stuff with him, but I was so like I was at LAX probably like at certain points like 3 times a week. So I not so jokingly said that I was seeing more of the airport than I was of my own living room. And so that was in some ways great because like I got to accomplish a lot. I got to achieve a lot. I got to do a lot. But in pushing so hard, pushing so fast, trying to do so much, I missed out on a lot of stuff as far as being a father. So yeah, I think as we slow down, appreciating that speed has it's almost like a dimmer switch. Like my colleague, Dr. Jimmy Yuan, one of my best friends, says, slow is a speed. And so, like, if we learn to train at these different speeds, we develop greater mastery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also this last year has kind of pushed everybody to slow down a little bit, right? Like we kind of were forced into this situation where hopefully people use that time to take that step back and be able to take advantage of, okay, you're staying home right now, you're stop and then reset. Now we're going to do this. It's been this very forced lesson in patience, I think, on so many levels with the pandemic. And it's fascinating. And I know that those that have been continuing some sort of health regimen or fitness training have all fared a lot better. Like we've been doing a lot of outreach with people on the ones that are at our school, and they've been great because they're continuing. And then we've tried to reach out to the ones that have just not been able to make it back in. And you could just feel the difference in those that have been able to keep some consistency and some normalcy in their lives. But I think the slowness I don't know if it's a slowness, but I think just the whole situation has been just kind of crazy for everybody. But I think that when you're forced to be confronted with that, I think it's very telling in what our nature is and then how to approach it, right? And so another thing I wanted to ask you about was kind of your upbringing, because you mentioned you were born in the States and of course Asian American, and right now is a interesting time to be Asian American. It's always been an interesting time to be Asian American, but it's been a controversial time, I guess would be more of the thing, as more information has come out into the public. But what was life growing up for you? Did you grow up in California?
I grew up in Delaware.
In
So yeah.
Delaware. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, just up the coast here.
Yeah. So you're an East Coaster. Sort of.
Originally, yeah.
Yeah.
I've been out in LA the majority of my life.
I know. Yeah, you're very West Coast. But so what was your experience growing up? I always find it interesting because I born in Boston, but grew up in Florida, which is not, if I had grown up in Boston, I think my perception of being Asian American would be very different. There's a Chinatown there. It's very different than Orlando, Florida. So I'm always curious as what the experience was for you. And then we can talk a little later about how things are going right now with the world.
Yeah, God. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways that could almost be a whole other episode. Growing up, honestly, growing up, it was very different. I mean, Delaware of the 70s versus, LA of now. It's like night. I mean, LA, even when I first got to LA back in 90, it was night and day from Delaware. I mean, Delaware back then in the 70s was a very like predominantly Caucasian, like not even that many Black families, negligible amount of Latinos, and like even fewer Asians. So like I remember for a lot of people I was like one of the first Asians they'd seen, so it was like, wow, okay. Yeah,
so you didn't stand out
and
much.
no, not at all, man. Granted, I didn't have the long hair back then. This is a much more recent development.
Yeah, that would definitely.
And this is not since
I don't know. In the 70s, it may have been a thing.
Yeah, it could have been, but yeah, my parents were pretty conservative, so yeah, none of that. Yeah, and this is not pandemic length growth. No, like this was pre-pandemic. So.
Okay. But yeah. I mean, it's such a hot topic now, having a lot of the anti-Asian hate crimes and racism that's happening now. I wonder though, did you experience, what a lot of people are feeling now, even as a child growing up, especially being surrounded by being kind of alone, feeling that loneliness, feeling that isolation. And did you ever have that feeling of wanting to blend in, like wishing you weren't Asian when you were young? I mean, these are like things children go through. So I'm really curious what that, if you don't mind sharing, of course, what that experience was.
No, not at all. I mean, gladly speak on that with absolute honesty. As a kid growing up, like I, looked at media all the time and be like, there's no one like me on the media other than like Bruce Lee or Saturday afternoon Kung Fu theater. Right. So being that those were like my archetypes as far as Asian male outside of my dad, it was like, yeah, okay, I think that's what I want to do. I want to learn martial arts. So that might have been what originally drew me to martial arts. But certainly, like, there were a lot of times when, like, as a kid growing up, either being bullied or getting into scraps because of, the color of my skin, or people like wanting to pick fights. You're like, hey, Cheng, whatever. I mean, like, you name the epithet, I'm sure I heard it. And I think that also too pushed me or motivated me more to want to learn martial arts, because it's like, I don't want to physically be at the mercy of someone else's goodness. Yeah. And while we can say optimistically, like, all people are at their core good, I don't agree with that. I don't just as easily, I don't think that all people are bad. I think that all people are opportunistic. So when it behooves them to be good, they will be good. When it behooves them to be bad, or allows them to kind of like, they feel like they can get away with being bad, people will do shady stuff. So not being myopic and not being kind of like delusional, like, I know that seems like a strong word, but really, like, I think that's one of the things that we in this generation, and certainly in today's situation, need to take a hard and honest look at, is that, like, we can't delude ourselves into thinking if we behave, then bad things won't happen to us. Like the old Thai man who was murdered. Murdered. I mean, let's call it what it is. He was murdered by someone who is like supposedly throwing a temper tantrum. Like, let's call it what it is. You know, that was a murder. He
Mm-hmm.
was minding his own business. And so what? He not behaving? Was he at fault? Like, I'd love to hear some of these apologists talking about like, oh, no. It's his fault in some way, shape, or form. No, it isn't.
Right.
Absolutely not. The only thing that is at fault in my mind is that like we as Asian Americans are all too often taught to keep your head down, work hard, you know, don't
Blend
rock the
in.
boat, blend in, right?
Yeah.
Assimilate. And for me as a kid, like my parents brought me up speaking English, um, and not Mandarin or not Cantonese because like they wanted me to do well in English. They wanted me to like have that kind of like assimilation experience.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, like, now we know, like, you have a sense of identity, you have a sense of culture, you have a sense of like being able to communicate and a competitive advantage, being able to be multilingual. So, we can say that hindsight's 2020, but yeah, I mean, like, these are things that I think culture is important, strength is important. So, like, in Strong First, there's a saying that strength has a greater purpose, and not just in terms of lifting, but also strength in terms of like character, strength to endure, but also strength to exert, right? Like if someone wants to threaten your safety or threaten the safety of someone you care about, you having the wherewithal to be able to dominate that situation or at least handle or diffuse that situation in a way that like allows you to continue to survive and thrive is clutch, and something that I think older generation Asian Americans, and certainly some even our age and younger, don't really respect enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a really frustrating time. And of course, this all started last year around the pandemic. But if you rewind and we can do the historical talk, and I am not a historian, but I mean, this is not a new thing for racism to exist against Asians. Like many Asian Americans that I've spoken to have shared similar experiences as yourself, where they were kind of the one token Asian person in their class, or, I was like one of three, the other two being Filipino, right? So it's kind of, it's just, you have these feelings that a lot of people really can't identify with. Because even my husband, he's a Latino male, right? But he also grew up in a dynamic where he wasn't the one Latino male amongst, all these different dynamics. I mean, he eventually ended up being there because he went out to private school out of his borough, but it's like
Mm-hmm.
a very different feeling because I, shared, well, when I was younger, I wanted to fit in more, whereas, as I got older, it didn't take very long, but as I got older, I was very much embracing who I am and my martial art background. And I think I went in the polar opposite. But as a young child, you just don't want to get picked on or looked at weird because you have a really weird lunch. You don't have a sandwich like everyone else. You have like fried rice and chicken and veggies, and it just even something as simple as that, right? You just feel like you don't fit in. And I think that I hope that as time goes on, like we look at now, like I look at all the young kids around me that are Asian American, like they don't have those same experiences because hopefully people are more aware. But then you see on the news, elderly people getting attacked, and then our former president, basically inciting that violence and encouraging the hate, right? And so it's like, are we moving forward at all, or is it because it's like I feel like we're at a standstill, and it's really frustrating. And then in some ways we didn't know what was going on because there was no social media and all these like Instagrams and things where you could see something right away. Was that better, or is it better now because now we see all of this, but then it's like so depressing.
I'll say we're in a better spot now, and I will give he who I don't really care to name some credit,
Me too.
as far as dredging the swamp or draining the swamp, because I think it's yeah, I think that there's some truth to that. There was the drainage of the swamp, but the drainage of the swamp ended up like draining everything out onto Main Street. So, rather than draining it and then disposing of it, draining it and then putting it out in the light of day. So now we all have to deal with it. Now, on one hand, we could say that, damn, now I have to deal with all of this racism, all this violence, all this. But really, all of that was in the closet for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Having grown up with some folks like that, I could tell you, like, plenty of people that would, use racial epithets, this, that, and the other, in within the privacy of their own home, or the safety of their own home, with like-minded folks or people that they trusted, versus like out in the open. So for people to be in a situation, for our society to be in a situation where we now have to see it and we can now address it, I think is a unique opportunity. It unquestionably sucks that we have to do it. And certainly, like, the damage, like the folks, the innocents who are being targeted, who are suffering, who are being assaulted, who are being murdered, who are being like evicted from their homes and now forced to deal with like homelessness and issues like that, who are being manipulated, not only in terms of their health, but in terms of their financial resources. That's unfortunately part of the suffering we have to go through in the change. Certainly the civil rights movement of the 60s, like, there were plenty of people who were murdered during that to get us to the next stage. But now we're on the next, like, if we had a period of quote unquote peace, that peace was hollow and false in a lot of ways. And luckily we're at a stage, I say luckily in some ways, but in a lot of ways, hopefully for our later generations, luckily we're in a situation now where we can at least admit and address those issues that have been heretofore kind of swept under the rug or hidden in the closet. Whereas now we are, like, people are coming out like full on screaming, like coming out into the light of day, out of the swamp, so to speak, and speaking their minds, speaking their hearts. And even though what we're seeing is a lot of hate, a lot of small-mindedness, a lot of bigotry, a lot of fear, a lot of violence, at least we can now address that rather than like pretending that everything's okay, because it wasn't okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. I definitely like to know who's on my side, right? Or who's my enemy, so to speak, or, because it's shocking to have seen, and hear some of the things that I've been exposed to in the last year, and just you don't realize where people stand until there's an opportunity for their true colors to show. And I really do believe to be silent is to be complicit, and which is honestly one of the reasons I started this podcast, was to be able to share other people's stories, to build empathy, and to speak out against the things that I feel need to be mentioned. So I do appreciate you sharing all of that. I think it's super important. I know you as a parent must have to articulate to your kids, like, how do you articulate in a time where they see something like that Thai man being murdered, just like I would, speak to a lot of my, African-American friends. Like, how do you talk to your kids about, well, these things happen because we look the way we look. Like, I don't have to articulate that. I mean, Oscar and I don't have children, but I mean, we mentor kids, but it's very different having to talk to your own kids. Like, what is that like for you?
It's for me personally, it's it falls into the category of things I wish I didn't have to do, kind of like bookkeeping. But no, really, I mean, like, I wish I didn't have to have that talk with my kids, and I certainly never imagined that in the 2020s, right, in this decade, we'd be having to have this discussion. I never imagined this growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly when President Obama was elected, like, I remember sitting in, my father was visiting at the time when the election results were announced for that election. And my father, I remember him crying tears of joy, saying, like, this is like amazing, son. You don't understand. And I go, what do you mean, Dad? And he's like, in my lifetime, I never imagined that there'd be a Black president. And like, there's hope. And I just, like, even now as I retell this, I was like, I have goosebumps, but, to tell my kids, like, hey, this is just reality. This is reality. There are people out there who will attack you just because of the color of your skin. Understand that. Like, Don't be freaked out about it. Don't be paralyzed by it. Don't be like fearful of it. Don't be hypervigilant, but just like pay attention. Like someone may come and attack you and may say things to you that you think are unfair, whatever. Don't wonder why, just get the hell out of the way or take evasive action and understand that that's just part of how it works. I mean, like in crossing a street, as you walk across the street, there is the possibility that even though there's a stop sign and you're in a well-marked crosswalk, that there's going to be a driver that doesn't pay attention. Now, I can stand in the crosswalk and then like glare that driver down and say like, well, you're violating the law. But if they're not paying attention and their stereo's on full blast, I'm going to end up as roadkill. So rather than getting fixated on right and wrong, I want to teach my kids like there's survival and there's reality and there's physics, right? Like if someone's attacking you, don't worry about all of the social commentary first. Get the hell out of the way. Or, you know, if it's someone that you can physically, master or dominate, and you're in a situation where you can't escape, exert that. Like you have been trained in martial arts since you were little. Like you have at least some kind of physical option. You know how to handle your body. So exercise those options. But understand too that like there are people out there that will do certain things, and it's not in your best interest to get caught up in the why. It's in your best interest to understand that like you need to evade, escape, whatever, right? The why is going to be part of a bigger conversation when you're not having to deal with survival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the same way earlier, we were talking about how, we have all these traditional backgrounds and we do our training, but now we have science and we meld the two. I love hearing what you just shared, because as much as I mean, my parents were the best. My whole life is dedicated to pretty much doing whatever I can for them. But that generation, and I don't know if it's the same for you, and I don't want to generalize, but a lot is not said. Right? There's a lot, like you said, it's just a kind of be quiet,
Oh, yeah.
under the rug. We don't know. No, we don't shake the boat. We don't talk about that. And even though, they have pretty much raised me with the beliefs I have. So there's something there to that. But it's like being open and sharing things. Like I'm a very, very strong advocate for children learning about personal space and their body identity and their sexual identity and things like that, because I'm a survivor, and so like I really appreciate that hope that our generation and those after us can be so much more open with the next generation and so on, because especially in the Asian American community, I find as that first generation from immigrants, right? Like you get very little in terms of guidance with these social cues and things that I think would have helped a lot along the way. And I think we have this opportunity to educate the youth in a way that, we just didn't get. And, all parents do the best they can. And in no way am I'm saying I was this like neglected child, but there's so much, especially in Asian culture, that is taboo to talk about. Mental health, all of that. So.
Certainly.
Right.
I mean, and then look at it on a societal level, right? Like, let's say, as a parent, like looking at issues such as postpartum, right? Like that back in the day, and actually a big applause to the entertainment industry, even Daredevil, right? I don't know if you caught any of those episodes, right? They talked about Matt Murdock and like how his mother abandoned him and like in the situations around that. And one of the things that they talked about during one of those episodes was like back then they didn't know what was going on. They just thought that something was amiss, and for whatever reason she was a bad mom. But like the behaviors that she was manifesting were due to postpartum depression. And so like I think a lot of what we're aware of now, we can contextualize better now, should give us a greater empathy and understanding. And so hopefully like these issues that we were taught to avoid or taught were taboo back then, like hopefully now we can address them with some intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we, like you said, all of the subjects that I like to touch on is like, oh, that could be its own episode. So we'll have to chat again for sure. We're coming up on our time, but I do want to ask you if there's anything that we need to promote in terms of like, are there any books or are there any material? Are there any courses or things that you want to share with our listeners so that they can learn more about you and what you do? But it's been a fascinating conversation. So I really appreciate your time.
Well, I'm honored. I mean, it's great to reconnect with you. Great to actually spend this time in conversation, and great to have this I think really enjoyable and hopefully for your listeners enlightening talk as well. Yeah. Really, the best way of finding out what I'm involved with is on my social media, and so my handle is pretty much universal all across, and it's Dr. MarkCheng. So at Dr. Mark Cheng. And so I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Instagram probably the best one to keep a finger on what I'm involved with. And as far as products, the one thing that I'm involved with right now that as far as growing and developing is K3 Combat. And so that is a kind of distillation of all the things that you were speaking of at the beginning of the episode, like martial arts, strength training, wellness, and rehabilitation. And so that project came about thanks to the urging of, like I said, my best friend, Dr. Jimmy Yuan, who said, like, man, you have so much stuff bubbling on your dome. Why don't you get it out there for the rest of the world? And so originally the conversation was around like, how does Dr. Mark Cheng train? Mm-hmm. And then it turned into like, okay, rather than looking at what I do for martial arts and tactical purposes, then how can we take all of these things, all of these warrior traditions, and use them to serve a greater slice of society, looking at what can we use these for in terms of athlete preparation, in terms of injury rehabilitation, in terms of overall wellness, not in terms of just like, let's lose some fat and move better, but let's, from a 360 squared view, improve the human experience. And so that's what turned into K3 Combat Movement Systems.
Awesome.
And so you can find out more about that at K3 Combat.
Okay. And I'll definitely link all of that here for our listeners and possibly viewers. Thank you. And again, it was just such a pleasure to talk to you. I learned so much. I love having these conversations because it's pretty much just all about me and I get to learn everything. And so hopefully listeners get some advantage as well. But I actually am at the receiving end of most of the benefits. So it was a pleasure, and hopefully you'll come back and join us again soon.
It'd be my honor. Thank you, Mimi.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat, and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com, or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.